Hello, everyone, and welcome. We will start in just about 17 seconds. We're going to give everyone a chance to get on and get their audio situated. Thank you for being here with us today. All right, we are going to get started. So, good afternoon, and welcome to the Indiana Youth Institute's webinar, Incorporating Youth Voice in Organizations. My name is Joshua Long. I am the Senior Educational Content Manager at IYI. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation. We are grateful to have the chance to connect as a community of Indiana youth workers who remain committed to meeting the needs of our youth and children. For those who are not familiar with IYI, our mission is to improve the lives of all Indiana children by strengthening and connecting the people, organizations, and communities that are focused on kids and youth. Listed here, you can see our vision that drives the work we do for Indiana youth. Now, before we begin, I'd like to share a few pointers that will help you engage with today's webinar. For any technical support issues, use the chat feature to send a message, and Aaron Whitcomb, IYI's registration manager, is behind the scenes to assist you. Use this feature to converse with the group as well. You will be given a copy of today's PowerPoint in an email sent to you following the presentation. We also encourage you to ask questions, so please use the Q&A feature for any you may have, and we will get to as many as possible. Feel free to upvote great questions to the top. Later today, you will receive an email with a link to complete an evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know your thoughts on today's presentation. If you don't receive the evaluation email, check your junk email as it may have been directed there. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of participation. Like all of IYI's webinars, today's webinar will be posted on our website if you'd like to revisit a portion later or share the opportunity to listen in with partners. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to our speaker for today, Amelia Coffey. Amelia.
Thank you so much, Josh. It's really a pleasure to be invited to speak with you all. I will just take a moment to share my slides and introduce myself. So let me go ahead and do that. So today I will be speaking to you about ways to incorporate youth voice in organizations. And a little bit about me. I'm a senior research associate at an organization called the Urban Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., but we do work in all 50 states and territories, including Indiana, absolutely. My specific portfolio focuses a lot on participatory approaches to research, including and especially with young people. And a lot of the topic areas that I focus on relate to how public support programs, so human services, serve young people, and looking specifically at kind of teenagers and young people in their early 20s and that sort of transitional stage. So I just want to emphasize going into this that I come at work on youth voice and youth leadership and engagement in organizations with a focus on human service agencies. I know a lot of you are sort of from nonprofits or other youth serving contexts, but the principles that I will share are widely applicable to all sorts of youth serving organizations. And just to give you a little overview of what's in store, I will first share some best practices around authentically engaging young people, followed by providing a few case examples of agencies who have done this successfully, taking different approaches. And then we'll take a little time to invite you all to think about applying learning, thinking about next steps, And I will ask you some questions about how you might apply those learnings, specifically any thoughts you have on how you might apply the lessons I've shared about incorporating youth voice in your organization, barriers you foresee to doing so, and any additional support you might need to make that happen. So just plugging that now so you can kind of keep that in mind and consider your potential answers as I go through sharing the content. So I'm going to get started with providing some key principles, as I said, around how to authentically engage young people so you can effectively lift up their voices when considering program planning and such for your organizations. Um, and so youth engagement exists on a continuum, which is often depicted as a ladder of engagement from sort of tactics at the bottom rungs of the ladder that might be said to exploit or kind of tokenize young people, all the way up to strategies that enable youth to take initiative, plan activities, and really take leadership in decision making. And the sort of bottom three rungs of the ladder, which are very adult led, reflect a concept called adultism, meaning behaviors and attitudes based on the assumption that adults are better or more competent than young people and entitled, therefore, to act upon them without their agreement, which, you know, and when thinking about authentic engagement is sort of what we want to avoid. But then moving all the way up the ladder, you see the sort of rungs of engagement getting more and more into youth taking initiative and being able to share decisions with adults. And so I hope this framework kind of gives you a sense of what different levels of engagement could look like with young people you serve, but I don't want you to think that the goal should be, you know, to achieve rung 8 immediately or nothing at all. I think it's worthwhile to consider how high up the ladder you can start, given the circumstances at your organization, and how to make that engagement worthwhile for young people and for your organization within the context of what you're able to do immediately. And just to define some terms here, when I say authentic youth engagement, that's an approach in which young people individually and collectively draw on their experiences and perspectives to help shape policies and programs that affect their everyday lives. And that means engaging young people in respectful and non-tokenizing ways where organizations can demonstrate to young people that their input is being truly considered. And when I say tokenism, really thinking about participation that is for show, quote unquote, where young people have very little influence over what that participation looks like. And even among, you know, organizations that might be very well intentioned in trying to get youth input and lift up youth voices, tokenism is common, especially you know, when you're trying to lift up the voices of underrepresented groups. You know, it's all about just trying to empower them and give them opportunities to engage in roles that aren't marginal. So you might be wondering what this looks like in practice for organizations. And here are some best practices around authentically engaging young people I've gleaned through a lot of work with organizations of all sorts that serve young people around the country, focused on using youth voice to improve their programming. And the sort of first bucket of best practices center around empowering young people to lead. And that means striving to use engagement methods on higher, you know, the higher end of that continuum that I shared, again, without letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. But wherever possible, sharing power does provide mutual benefit. So that means you're building up young people, you know, oftentimes providing them with professional skills and experience and building their confidence where they may, you know, have experienced a lot of challenges and trauma in their lives that sort of, you know, factor against that. So that's a benefit for them. And then as you're doing so, you're also sort of platforming them to provide more useful input on your programming. So that's where that mutual benefit comes in. It's also about co-creating leadership opportunities with young people, with a focus on inclusivity, again, giving the opportunity for them to really take charge where possible, feel comfortable giving input, and even conceptualizing and leading opportunities for input. And part of it is also importantly accounting for power imbalances. So, young people aren't necessarily accustomed to being invited to the table on equal footing with adults. So, working on that trust building and saying, hey, we really value your lived expertise. And then ensuring accountability to young people. And this is something I really want to emphasize because I think one of the things that you can do to really demonstrate that you are truly valuing their input is to ensure that you can sort of demonstrate here's how your input is being considered, or even ideally how it has been put into effect in terms of program changes or process changes, and that'll really make people feel like more inclined to engage on an ongoing basis and more trusting and making them feel valued. Second bucket of best practice is compensating young people equitably for their expertise. And part of that is expanding notions of what constitutes expertise to include lived experience as opposed to just professional experience, and therefore compensating young people for sharing their experience as they would be for sharing professional expertise. And we've observed in research a variety of compensation approaches that have been successful, from internship arrangements, consulting arrangements, even direct hires, among others. And I'll share some concrete examples of doing so in a bit. But above all, it's important to match young people's needs to the compensation approaches. So really thinking about things that might not come up if you're necessarily thinking about how to compensate, your adult staff, full-time staff, or even, adult contractors, for example. But, what support do young people need to file their taxes? Or, does the banking arrangement that they have with their family sort of work out when it comes to getting the funds? The next topic is kind of providing opportunities for professional development for young people. And I like to say, it's important to start with thinking about what a junior employee needs to perform well and to grow in their career using the position they have as a stepping stone. So that might include establishing clear expectations, consistent communication, opportunities for increased responsibility and skill building as they're, gaining experience in their role, providing input. And of course, this kind of presupposes that you're sort of engaging them on an ongoing basis, which of course is a goal in an ideal world. And then also creating opportunities for professional networking, which often young people, especially folks who might be engaged in some of the youth programming that you all are providing, might not otherwise have a lot of opportunities to gain. And then finally, it's important to identify and reimagine practices rooted in bias, including reflecting on how operations and your organization may reinforce inequities between groups of young people, shifting assumptions that marginalized groups have less to contribute, which is just kind of a latent assumption that folks often make in our society, unfortunately, and then recognizing and honoring young people's differing cultural sensibilities and life experience, and actually how that affects their perspectives can really be a benefit, because then, when you invite them and make them feel comfortable sharing that perspective, you're getting a much better, more well-rounded, sense of young people's perspectives on your programming, who you're trying to serve. And then part of that is creating space for young people to identify where they see inequities in your organizational processes, and relates back to that trust building and showing respect and that you value their voice. So there are a variety of ways to capture youth voice that involve authentic engagement, and all of these can be used at various steps along the ladder, all the way up to being youth initiated with young people's decision-making power. And we can capture youth voice through traditional research activities, which again can be youth-led, including things like surveys and focus groups. A more innovative research tool that I like to use are called data walks, and I'm happy to share some tools around setting those up. But what that involves is kind of taking key pieces of information. So that can be sort of in a data research context, using your administrative data, or just sort of key questions that you have or observations about your program that you want to get feedback on, and kind of depicting them visually. And oftentimes we'll sort of put posters on the wall and then have a facilitator who will facilitate discussions with young people to kind of elicit their feedback. And then asking young people to tell their story is also an important way to capture youth voice. And there are a number of ways to do that, including photo voice, which is a visual research method that puts cameras in the hands of young people and enables them to document aspects of a topic that might manifest that you're trying to explore around your program or around their needs and life experience or whatever you're interested in. And then it allows young people to come together and discuss their thoughts and challenges depicted in the images, and what solutions might be. And that really gives young people the opportunity to give priority to their concerns. Social media is often and also a powerful way to meet young people where they're at, so to speak, a common tool for youth engagement work. And it works best when you're connecting young people who are already connected in some way, sort of through their preferred social media platform. You can open topics for discussion, call new ideas without having to convene a group in person, which I'm sure you all know can be a challenge sometimes. And I do want to say a cautionary note around asking young people to tell their story, because it can kind of be re-traumatizing sometimes, as I'm sure you all, many of you are aware. It can make a young person even feel responsible for an outcome that's outside of their control, or just sort of condition that exists in the community, perhaps. So, just something to keep in mind when sort of doing those types of activities. You want to be delicate about it. And then finally, youth advisory boards are made up of young people selected to give their perspectives as advisors and decision makers. So then those tend to be sort of at the upper rungs of the ladder of engagement, and kind of an ongoing role. And they provide a link between an organization and young people to ensure young people's priorities and concerns are reflected in the organization's goals and processes. And that there are also a lot of best practices around youth advisory boards that I'm happy to share as well. So with all those best practices in mind, I'll provide some examples of agencies who have successfully captured youth voice and used it to improve their programming. And just a note for context, these examples come from an Urban Institute ongoing project called Young People in the Safety Net that I've led for a number of years, that's highlighted gaps and challenges with providing human services to young people, and how sort of inequities have contributed to many young people having insufficient access to those programs. And one important strategy identified through that work is engaging young people in improving programs and services, and the importance of that. So identifying examples of agencies successfully capturing youth voice has been a really key component of that work, and that's sort of reflected in these examples. So the first example centers around the County of Santa Clara, California Social Services Agency, or SSA. And for a little context on Santa Clara, that is a large, wealthy, and diverse county in what is sort of colloquially known as Silicon Valley. And so, despite a lot of the wealth that exists there, there's also a lot of inequality and social need, especially among young people. And SSA is the primary public agency that provides those major human services like Medicaid and SNAP and so forth to county residents. And so to dive into how SSA developed a youth-led evaluation approach, which is the case I'm going to highlight here, the approach grew steadily over a number of years. And since 2016, SSA's Department of Employment and Benefit Services has administered Intern and Earn, which is an employment program that provides paid internships to young people who are receiving public benefits through the county. And the evaluation work started out just pretty small scale with program staff soliciting feedback through informal conversations and surveys. And then that effort grew as in 2017 to 2018, the program developed a formal partnership with SSA's Office of Research and Evaluation that does internal sort of research functions for the agency. And they had received feedback from those sort of initial input activities from young people, emphasizing the importance of putting young people in leadership roles to drive improvement to the program. And that led to hiring former participants as community workers who, among other things, perform research and evaluation activities to inform programming. And then the following year, program and ORE staff partnered on a youth participatory action research or YPAR pilot. And this involved a community worker collaborating with ORE, including receiving ongoing training on research and evaluation, which equipped them to co-lead focus groups with young people participating in the internship program to understand their lived experience and needs. And then in 2020 to 2021, ORE launched an ongoing YPAR peer evaluator initiative, which involved hiring a student intern to serve as an ongoing peer evaluator. The student intern, I think at that point there may have been actually multiple conducted evaluation activities during COVID, including telephone interviews to really capture young people's needs and coping mechanisms during that time. And then since 2021, ORE received a budget allocation for youth evaluation leadership. In part, staff at the program attributed, and at SSA attributed this budget allocation to advocacy from the community workers who'd been involved in this effort. They were platformed to advocate for funding before agency staff as well as county board of supervisors. And community workers regularly partner now with program participants on evaluation activities. And youth leadership has increasingly been recognized throughout SSA as leaders, and young people have advocated for these efforts. And then I think program leadership shifting perspective on youth voice through these experiences of youth evaluation leadership is nicely captured in this quote from the program manager who oversees Intern and Earn, the internship program, and just showing how, young people bring a different perspective, and that really became evident, and the importance of capturing that through this experience. And so there were several key kind of conditions or facilitators that existed in SSA and in the internship program that allowed for the successes that this effort enjoyed, including really bought in leadership at the levels of the program, ORE, as well as agency leadership and even, as I said, political leadership at the level of the Board of Supervisors. Relatedly, agency leaders who were bought in were adept at fundraising and identifying sort of how specific human service program funding could be braided with county funding to support bringing on of interns and community workers. Also creative planning, which again is related, sort of leadership was able to identify ways to sort of creatively interpret and leverage the county code to bring on those community workers. And then overall, SSA benefits from the internal research capacity of ORE, which includes a particular individual and a few folks with research experience and sort of dedication in particular in the area of youth participatory research, which I think is important context, but also don't want to make it seem like all of these factors need to be in place. And I think it's just worth saying that it was helpful. And then in contrast, there were some key challenges experienced. It did take a lot of proactive effort for the program leadership, ORE leadership, as well as the young leaders involved in evaluation to change the culture so that the young people's voice was really valued and sought. And that was really a multi-year effort where young people were given opportunities to lead meetings and share findings. And over time, adult staff sort of proactively more and more started to seek out their perspectives. And then staffing young people, I think here as well as elsewhere, as many of you can probably imagine, just involves some challenges given sort of the life stage and circumstances of young people with lived experience in county human service programming. A lot of young people may be going in and out of different types of employment or education or have conflicting family responsibilities and all of those kinds of factors can lead to increased turnover. So, that's just sort of a fact that needs to be taken into account. But, I think want to emphasize the strategy was successful in a number of ways. It did lead to increased funding for both the internship program and for continued youth leadership, which was an effort, as I said, led by the young people themselves to advocate for that funding. It also led to concrete program improvements, including taking young people's input and translating it into internship opportunities, so placements at specific employers that better aligned with young people's professed interests, as well as increasing hours and providing higher wages that made the internships more competitive with other employment options that might pay a little bit more in the short term, or at least initially did. And young people felt inclined to take those sometimes for that reason. But, there was a feeling that they didn't offer as much long-term benefit to the young people. So young people had this outlet through providing their voice in the evaluation process. And then that was translated into these improvements. And then the second case example focuses on the state of Oregon's Youth Experiencing Homelessness program. And for a little context on Oregon, that state has among the highest proportion of young people experiencing homelessness among US states, unfortunately, particularly among unaccompanied young adults. And the Youth Experiencing Homelessness program is a small office within the state's Department of Human Services, and their main function is to fund local service providers to provide resources to young people experiencing housing insecurity. And so the development of a variety of youth engagement activities that this program helped move forward that I want to highlight started with the program leadership working to include youth input in program design, sort of over time in an increasingly broad set of capacities starting in 2018, when the program coordinator began looking for ways to embed youth leadership in operations, including supporting young people on the existing statewide Youth Homelessness Advisory Committee. And what that looked like was sort of taking time to develop relationships with young people on the committee, acting in a mentorship role and providing them with networking opportunities. And then in 2021, the program contracted with a vendor to conduct a statewide needs assessment for young people experiencing homelessness. And that looked like local youth serving programs sharing the opportunity to participate with young people and recruiting them for a series of focus groups to discuss their needs and priorities around homelessness programming. And the same year, in response to feedback from that needs assessment on the need for a youth advisory board to advise that existing youth committee, the program funded a youth serving organization to engage young people around what that board should look like. And young people presented a proposal to the parent agency of the program, who were then convinced to provide funding for this effort. And at the same time, the program developed a plan to compensate young people at a rate of up to $25 an hour for their input efforts. And then since 2022, in response to prior youth input activities that I mentioned, which identified the need for cash assistance as a priority for young people experiencing housing insecurity, the program partnered with the state's Housing and Community Services Department on a direct cash transfer pilot for this population. And then there was a feeling that they wanted to really platform young people to be leaders in designing the pilot, and that the $25 compensation maximum that the state had established for these types of youth input activities was insufficient for that. So the program arranged a contractor to pay the consultants at $115 an hour or up to $30,000 over 15 months. So that was really like a full-time job for a few youth consultants who really took on leadership roles in supporting pilot planning. And then also since 2022, the program has worked to stand up the Youth Advisory Board, which the vision is it will advise multiple agencies on the needs of this population. And the program submitted a funding request to the state legislature based on young people's identified policy priorities, including hiring staff with lived experience of housing insecurity to support the Youth Advisory Board. And I think that this quote from a key program staff member, which discusses young people's input and how it could positively shape programming, and how that became evident, kind of nicely captures, again, sort of the journey that the adult staff went on as they were engaged in these input efforts, and how it really became evident how important getting that youth voice is. And so as with the first case study, there were several key facilitators or conditions in place that helped with the success of these efforts. The first being program and agency leadership, again, being really dedicated to these activities. They also benefited from similar to the first case study, a platform for young people to advocate for change. They were able to platform young people in front of state legislators, as well as, agency leadership. And the program itself benefited from having a very flexible funding structure. And another key facilitator that staff at the program identified was just doing a lot of community engagement and relationship building. So what that looked like was going all around the state and engaging with youth service providers, many of which I think might sort of have a lot in common with many folks on this call, who have these deep, direct, trusting relationships with young people, and that sort of allowed the program to reach and engage young people from a footing of trust, and that was identified as really important. And then some key challenges included navigating state bureaucracy to enact changes. Folks mentioned, this happened during COVID, which was just a bit of a chaotic time, and there was new funding infusions, but sometimes it was hard to work out, how to allocate that funding and distribute it. And sometimes, those types of conditions can lead to delays. I think probably inside or outside the context of COVID and in sort of developing some of these innovations, also coordinating with multiple state agencies to agree to establish one youth advisory board rather than having each agency have their own board. So basically advocating for the young people's vision took time. And then compensation, also came with its challenges, even given the great success that the program achieved with this arrangement to provide really robust compensation for young people. There was still, especially with the direct cash transfer pilot consulting arrangements. Young people reported that the process of establishing those arrangements was confusing, and anticipating their tax burden was confusing and things like that. And so they learned that, young people in those circumstances need a little more support. And then embedding youth leadership is also anticipated to come with some challenges in the future. The program is working to create a structure that will sort of allow some of these input efforts and structures like the board to continue and be sort of shielded from budget cuts or changes in key personnel. But this is just a challenging undertaking given many competing priorities. And then finally, just ensuring representativeness of the young people on these boards and young people giving input in general is really important, but also always just an ongoing challenge because you're never going to be perfectly representative. So it's always just something to continue striving for. And so there were many achievements of this effort. As I said, it led to new youth-led programming, including the Youth Advisory Board that's being stood up and the direct cash transfer pilot, created precedents for young people speaking directly to leadership to advocate for change, and created youth compensation procedures, which the program anticipates that they can continue to leverage and use to sort of make these youth input processes flow more smoothly in the future. It also led to funding requests for future programming based on young people's priorities. And last I checked in with the program, several of those items had actually already been approved by the state legislature, which is very exciting. So just a couple of key takeaways from these case examples overall. I think we see that young people can be really powerful catalysts for program improvements, especially when they're put in leadership positions and in advocacy positions. The value of young people's leadership can speak for itself and make the case for funding again when they are platformed in the right way. And I want to say also when they're trained and built up and made to feel confident and comfortable in those settings. We also see that staffing young people in leadership roles can be challenging for some of the reasons I mentioned around their life circumstances and developmental stage. And changing culture to value youth input takes time and intentionality, but is possible. Leadership buy-in is a really key facilitator. You want to have leadership who understands the importance of this and can push it forward. Often they are involved in identifying funding flexibilities, which can be critical. So now I'll offer some ideas for next steps and get a sense of what you all are kind of thinking in terms of how you could enact youth engagement strategies in your own organizations to lift up youth voice. And so this graphic isn't meant to be comprehensive, but here are some steps that organizations may be able to take based on what we found in our work to plan and implement changes to programming to better meet the needs of young people you serve. So, you might start at the top with examining program implementation and work around. And, this is likely to be an iterative process with the cycle kind of repeating itself. As you move forward with engaging young people and improving your program. And so now I'd like to invite members of the audience to join us in a dialogue about how you might apply some of the lessons that I've shared today in your own organization. And I'll ask you to respond to a few questions through polls. Also want to invite folks to speak up or enter your thoughts in the chat and explain your answers a little bit if you're so inclined. But the first poll, and I want to say, I believe you can only choose one option, but I would just ask you to kind of choose the one that speaks most to you, that you're most intrigued by, or kind of that seems most likely to as a next step for your organization. So the first question is, how would you like to engage young people at your organization? And you'll see some options that should appear on your screen. So I'll give you about 30 seconds or so to to offer your response. And again, feel free to explain your response in the chat. Okay, and that's really interesting to know. It seems like there's a lot of interest in setting up youth advisory boards. So again, I'm happy to share resources around that afterwards. But I'm encouraged because that is a really great way to get ongoing, authentic feedback from young people. And then moving on to the next poll, next question. What tools are you most interested in using to engage young people at your organization? And again, you'll see the options pop up and we'll give you a few moments to consider your response. Let's see. Okay, so a little bit of a varied set of responses here. So it looks like there's some interest in traditional research activities as well as um, advisory boards and social media. I see that one of the folks in the chat mentioned they have a YPAR project going on. Very cool to hear about. Okay. And then somebody else is interested in using social media and youth engagement via board or dialogue. Sounds great. And then the third question is, what are a few steps that you could take to recruit young people to be involved in these engagement activities? And again, just take a few moments to consider your response. And I know it says a few steps, but just consider the one that seems the most intriguing or most plausible to you. Let's see. Okay, so it looks like folks are interested in direct outreach, announcing the opportunity during programming and advertising on social media. That sounds great. Thanks for those responses. The next question, and this is the final poll, so thank you all for engaging, is what would you do to develop young people as leaders once they were onboarded? And just consider what the top option seems like. And somebody says that they're doing all of the above when it comes to outreach, partnering with existing groups and offering tables at schools. That's really great. I mean, I should say, as folks can imagine, I'm sure a lot of people on this call do various youth engagement activities, and you're aware that it takes often multiple methods to reach different people. So that makes a lot of sense. And then it looks like hands-on learning experiences are sort of the top preferred method of engaging young people as leaders. Also significant interest in mentorship, which is great to see. And then, oh, and I'm sorry, I missed this one, but one final poll. What obstacles do you see to enacting youth engagement strategies? And that's the question that you'll really be responding to in the poll. And then I'm also curious if anyone is willing to just contemplate and drop in the chat what could be done to overcome those obstacles. But just for the poll's sake, consider what obstacles you see to enacting these strategies. Okay, it looks like people see all sorts of different obstacles, which isn't necessarily surprising, but funding, leadership buy-in, internal staff capacity, external partnership development, policy constraints could all potentially be challenges, I'm sure, depending on your circumstances. So thanks for that feedback. Okay, and thanks again for engaging in those polls. So now I'd like to just invite you all to take a few moments to consider these discussion questions and to offer responses in the chat. And so we're wondering what information or additional information your organization would need to adopt a strategy for engaging young people to improve programming, as well as what resources or peer learning opportunities would be helpful. And so, would it be helpful to have a community of practice, to see more, examples of best practices? And then Holly, I see, has a question, how to vet your youth. Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, like how to make sure that they're a good match for the opportunity that you're trying to offer to give input. I think that there are definitely materials out there around, making sure that you're getting the right mix and that folks are able um, to really engage. See, Stephanie says, I have a hard time convincing people in leadership. If we build it for them, they will come. Yeah, I think that there's sometimes it has to go in that direction for sure. Somebody says case studies help. I'd love to know if there are a repository of YPAR projects. Yeah, one website I would suggest looking at is UC Berkeley has a YPAR hub website and has some examples of a lot of the work that they do with organizations to partner and stand up YPAR projects. And someone says our current membership Interviews new candidates to ensure they know what they're getting into. Yeah, that's definitely a key part of it. And also, I would suggest that just providing extensive onboarding and training is important. And sort of sometimes through that process, people will maybe realize that this opportunity isn't for them. That's interesting, the idea of continuing to get more kids' ideas on leadership. I have to say, I have a little bit less of a perspective on getting younger kids engaged in these activities, and that comes with different considerations, but that's very intriguing. Um, Claire says that the challenge for her organization would be that there are so many objectives we need to meet for grant funding. We run the risk of asking for student input and not being able to implement what they recommend. And I think that's where really just setting expectations is key, like developing that trust so they know you're trying and you're considering their responses, and really being transparent and saying, hey, like this is how our funding situation is and what we're required to do as a result of it. And I think that, a lot of times that's just like a real blurry area, black box for young people that they don't consider. So I think just sort of peeling back that curtain and explaining to them how those decisions get made, and how you're kind of trying to find opportunities to make change within those constraints can do a lot to show that you're being accountable to them. But thank you guys for those thoughts. That's really helpful. Um, and then we do have a few more minutes. I'd like to open things up to discussion for any further comments or questions, which you can feel free to drop in the chat or in the Q&A box.
Yeah,
I see.
I'll lead it off with a question that I have. I have a couple
Sure.
here. The first is leadership buy-in is obviously super important. In your research with your case studies, did the initial idea for youth involvement come from leadership, or did it come from somewhere else where they had to develop that buy-in?
Yeah, I mean, I will say, I think it has tend to come in terms of like the real driving force from more sort of program level leadership and folks who are more involved in the in day-to-day program with young people, but maybe who had the ear of leadership and were able to kind of socialize some of these ideas to them. And then they just ended up benefiting from sort of people who were in a position to make change being receptive.
Gotcha.
But again, I don't think, yeah, that's a good question, because I think I should specify probably, it doesn't have to be that like the CEO of your organization has to be the initial driving force, so this can't get off the ground, but more just like
Yeah.
getting that buy-in is often important.
Yeah, because I think with incorporating youth, if it's coming from a CEO, it's probably going to happen. But if it's not, what are the different paths to getting that buy-in, and what strategies work and what strategies didn't work?
Yeah, and
Um,
sometimes the proof is in the pudding too, right? With just platforming young people, like if you take some time to train them and to be their own best advocates, that can be helpful to say, hey, we're gonna platform you to meet with the CEO and articulate why your priorities are important and how we can sort of move in that direction as an organization. Not saying it's going to work every time, but there is precedent for that being successful.
yeah. Next question. There's a couple slides that included compensating young people. And so my first question is, what sort of youth involvement did organizations compensate for? So internships, consultants, even youth advisory. And then a follow-up to that, what were some of the solutions they developed to be able to provide compensation?
Yeah. Sorry, can you repeat the first question?
Yeah, the first question is what were some of the engagements, youth engagements that
Oh,
organizations compensated for?
yeah. I mean, anything where they're providing their lived expertise, they, you know, should generally be compensated for. It doesn't always happen, but in the examples that I gave, it ranged from, just providing input in focus groups all the way up to being consultants to a pilot program, and getting sort of an ongoing salary equivalent, and everything in between. The evaluation leaders had a number of different compensation arrangements that included having an internship and being funded in that way through their agency. And a few were eventually hired as direct employees using braided county and human service funding. Uh, the sort of one-off funding in the case of the Oregon example for sort of ad hoc input sessions was more just a direct cash payment. Um, so there, I think within the constraints of your organization or agency, it can look different. But again, also just thinking about what's useful for young people, I think is important. I think a lot of times folks are inclined to do something that might be the easiest for them administratively, like give a gift card, but that's not the same for young people as actually getting paid in cash or cash equivalent like we would get as employees at an organization. So it's not the ideal arrangement.
Yep. So just following up, there was a question that came through, and this will be our last one. Can you
Mm-hmm.
give some ideas on how to start a youth advisory board? So what that would look like, how to engage them, that sort of thing.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I will offer a number of resources to do so, which I'm happy to put you in contact with, and that might do it more justice. But I mean, I think thinking about what your goals are and who you really want to be represented in terms of like what are they going to be giving feedback on? Is it the entire program? Is it a specific aspect of it? Is it specific types of experiences that you're interested in? And then kind of matching that with the composition of the board, doing a lot of different, ideally types of outreach to advertise the opportunity, and then doing some of the sort of onboarding activities to that we'd mentioned to ensure that folks are equipped to join. So like interviews, providing information sessions, doing training on what the board will entail, and standing up compensation avenues are important processes to get involved in. And early on, I think also it's important to think of it as something that is ideally eventually going to be youth led. So a lot of successful youth advisory boards, you know, might start with a sort of structure that's developed by adults with their own sort of agenda, but then as folks get trained and onboarded, they're able to take more and more leadership over it and set their own agendas, and advocate for change kind of on their own terms. And there's a lot more that is, again, kind of written about this that I'm happy to share.
Great. So Amelia, I think you have one or two more slides if you want to just overview those, and then I'll take it over to close it out.
Oh, sure. So really the last thing is just that, as I said, there's a lot of resources out there that might inform some of your efforts moving forward in the realm of youth engagement. I invite you all to look at Urban Institute's Young People in the Safety Net project page that includes a number of resources around youth engagement. Um, it's again from the human services kind of perspective, but I think that there's a lot there that is more widely applicable. Urban Institute also has a community engagement resource hub that offers several resources that might be relevant. And again, we'll be sending these slides around, and I'm happy for you all to contact me. So I'm just going to put my email up here for a moment, and I'm happy to sort of talk through strategies or offer resources. So thank you all for the opportunity to share.
Yes, thank you so much, Amelia, for that. As we finish up, I just want to first put a plug into our upcoming events. Next month, our webinar is on September 18th. It is the social roots of adolescent suicide. And then, same as last month, we have a huge plug here for our annual Kids Count conference that is in person in Indianapolis, December 3rd and 4th. Registration is open now. So please, we encourage you to sign up for that early. The best way to stay in contact with us is through our weekly update newsletter. It has the latest updates on youth issues in Indiana, professional education trainings, and organizational capacity opportunities. You can find that at IYI.org/newsletters. And as we conclude, I want to thank everyone that joined us today, in addition to our speaker. We appreciate your impact and value your voice and the choice you made to learn and partner with IYI today. You will receive an email that includes a copy of the presentation, as well as a link to complete evaluation of this webinar. Please take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about today's presentation. If you don't receive that evaluation email, check your junk email, as it may have been directed there. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be redirected to your certificate of completion. That concludes our presentation, and on behalf of Indiana's youth, thank you again for showing up today and every day for Indiana youth.